Our journey into the mind of Niccolò Machiavelli must begin not in the quiet solitude of a philosopher's study, but amidst the vibrant, often brutal, chaos of Renaissance Florence. To understand Machiavelli, we must first understand the crucible that forged him. A city of unparalleled artistic brilliance and ruthless political intrigue, a place where profound humanism coexisted with mercenary warfare, and where the most sublime beauty often masked the ugliest machinations of power. This was a city that would carve its indelible mark onto his very soul, shaping his thoughts not through abstract theory, but through the searing heat of direct experience. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in 1469 into a relatively established, though not wealthy or aristocratic, Florentine family. His father, Bernardo, was a doctor of law, ensuring Niccolò received a thorough humanist education. He was steeped in the classics, devouring the works of ancient Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus, and mastering Latin, which would become the very language of his later intellectual communion with the ancients. Yet, unlike many scholars who merely studied these texts in academic detachment, Machiavelli would come to see them as living blueprints, case studies in the eternal struggle for power and the enduring foibles of human nature, directly applicable to the tempestuous world outside his window. Florence, at the time of Machiavelli's youth, was a city perpetually caught between the glittering age of the Medici and the fervent desire for republican liberty. The Medici family, master bankers and patrons of the arts, had, for decades, effectively ruled Florence through a careful manipulation of republican institutions, maintaining the outward appearance of a free republic while consolidating an impressive, yet ultimately fragile, personal power. Lorenzo the Magnificent, perhaps the most brilliant of them all, died in 1492, just as Machiavelli was coming of age. Lorenzo's death was a seismic event, often seen as marking the end of the Italian Renaissance's golden age, ushering in a period of intense instability and foreign intervention. His son, Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici, proved woefully inadequate to the task of maintaining his father's delicate balance of power. A series of disastrous decisions, particularly his capitulation to the invading French King Charles VII in 1494, led to the swift and ignominious expulsion of the Medici from Florence. The city erupted in a fervor of republicanism, mingled with a potent wave of moralistic zeal, largely orchestrated by an unlikely, yet immensely powerful figure, Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a Dominican friar, a fiery, charismatic preacher who denounced the corruption of the church, the decadence of Florentine society, and the tyranny of the Medici. He preached a terrifying vision of God's judgment, prophesying ruin if Florence did not repent and embrace strict asceticism. And for a time, Florence did. His sermons captivated the populace, who, still reeling from the French invasion and the Medici's failure, saw divine judgment in the unfolding chaos. Under Savonarola's influence, Florence underwent a dramatic, if brief, transformation. Luxury was shunned, gambling was outlawed, and the infamous burning of the vanities saw thousands of paintings, elaborate costumes, secular books, and musical instruments consumed by flames in the Piazza della Signoria. Botticelli himself, it is said, threw some of his own works into the fire. For a young Niccolò Machiavelli, this period was an invaluable, visceral lesson in the nature of political power, popular passion, and the perilous fragility of charisma alone. Savonarola was a man of immense popular influence, a true, unarmed prophet, as Machiavelli would later characterize him in The Prince. He commanded the hearts and minds of the Florentine people, seemingly able to bend the city to his will through the sheer force of his moral conviction and rhetorical skill. Yet his power was ultimately ephemeral. He lacked the means to enforce his will beyond the temporary consent of the populace and the terror inspired by his prophecies. When the political winds shifted, when the Pope excommunicated him, and when the people grew weary of his austerity, his authority crumbled. He was arrested, tortured, hanged, and his body burned in the very same piazza where he had ignited the vanities, a stark and chilling spectacle Machiavelli witnessed firsthand. This experience etched itself deeply into Machiavelli's understanding of power. He saw how easily a people could be swayed by fervent belief, but also how quickly that belief could turn to resentment and rejection if not underpinned by more substantial structures of authority. Savonarola's tragic end was a testament to the idea that moral virtue, prophetic vision, or popular love, however profound, are insufficient without the capacity for coercion, without, as Machiavelli would put it, a force to command. It was a foundational insight. Good intentions, spiritual authority, and popular support are fleeting without the pragmatic application of power. With Savonarola's dramatic fall in 1498, Florence established a new, more stable republican government. And it was into this government in the same year that a 29-year-old Niccolò Machiavelli entered public life. He was appointed to the prestigious position of Second Chancellor of the Republic, and crucially, as Secretary to the Ten of Liberty and Peace, the Dici di Libertà e Pace, the Florentine magistracy responsible for foreign affairs and defense. This was no sinecure, it was a demanding, hands-on role that plunged him directly into the gritty realities of statecraft. For 14 years, from 1498 to 1512, Machiavelli served the Florentine Republic with unflagging dedication. These were not years spent in academic contemplation, they were years of relentless action, a crash course in practical politics. He drafted dispatches, analyzed intelligence, managed internal administration, and perhaps most significantly, undertook numerous diplomatic missions on behalf of Florence. These missions would provide him with an unparalleled, empirical understanding of the shifting landscape of Italian and European power. He traveled to the court of Louis XVI in France, to the Emperor Maximilian in Germany, and repeatedly, crucially, to the infamous Cesare Borgia in Romagna. His encounters with Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, were particularly illuminating, offering Machiavelli a masterclass in the ruthless acquisition and maintenance of power. Borgia was a figure of immense energy, ambition, and strategic cunning. He sought to carve out a new state in central Italy, the Romagna, from a patchwork of squabbling, weak principalities. Machiavelli witnessed Borgia's methods firsthand. His swiftness in decision, his capacity for decisive action, his blend of force and deception, and his brutal efficiency in consolidating his authority. One of the most telling anecdotes from Machiavelli's dispatches concerns Borgia's infamous act at Senigallia in 1502. Borgia had shrewdly used several mercenary captains to help him conquer various towns in Romagna. When these captains grew disloyal and conspired against him, Borgia lured them to Senigallia under the pretext of reconciliation. There, he had them all arrested and summarily executed. Machiavelli, present during parts of this affair, recorded it with a chilling detachment, acknowledging the immense risk Borgia took and the audacious ruthlessness with which he secured his position. For Machiavelli, this was not an act to be morally judged in isolation, but a case study in political necessity. Borgia had consolidated his disparate forces, eliminated his rivals, and established his authority through a single, swift, terrifying stroke. He had, as Machiavelli would later write in The Prince, learned that newly acquired states must be done away with all at once if one wishes to hold them securely. Machiavelli admired Borgia's virtù, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but a potent blend of skill, courage, foresight, and adaptability. Borgia seemed to embody the ideal of a prince who could master fortune. He understood that relying on mercenary armies was inherently risky, and so he began to build his own military force. He knew how to inspire fear and respect, yet Borgia also served as a cautionary tale. Despite his immense virtù, he was ultimately undone by an unforeseen twist of Fortuna. The sudden, unexpected death of his father, Pope Alexander VI, and his own incapacitating illness, both occurring at a critical juncture. Borgia, though seemingly invincible, found himself at the mercy of events beyond his control, a powerful reminder to Machiavelli that even the most skillful leader can be overwhelmed by the capricious whims of fate. This would become a central theme in The Prince, the perpetual struggle between a ruler's virtù and the unpredictable power of Fortuna. His missions to France and Germany offered different but equally important insights. In France, he observed the intricacies of foreign alliances, the dangers of relying on auxiliary troops, and the strategic blunders of a powerful state attempting to intervene in Italian affairs. He learned that the French, despite their military might, often made fatal errors, such as alienating their allies or failing to consolidate their conquests. These observations would directly inform his arguments in The Prince regarding the foolishness of relying on foreign support and the necessity of a state possessing its own robust military. In Germany, he noted the strong communal spirit, the citizens' willingness to defend their liberties, and the decentralized nature of the Holy Roman Empire, contrasting it with the more centralized, often chaotic Italian city-states. Through these experiences, Machiavelli began to formulate a philosophy rooted in direct observation rather than abstract ideals. He wasn't just reading about politics. He was living it, breathing its tension, watching its players up close. He saw firsthand how often leaders failed when they adhered to conventional morality in a world that did not, and how easily even the most brilliant plans could be derailed by unforeseen events. This practical immersion taught him that effective governance often demanded actions that were, by conventional standards, immoral or cruel, yet politically necessary for the survival and stability of the state. Crucially, Machiavelli's intellectual framework for understanding these experiences was deeply shaped by Renaissance humanism, yet he twisted it into something radically new. Humanism was, at its heart, a revival of classical learning, emphasizing human agency, civic virtue, rhetoric, and a deep appreciation for the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanists like Leonardo Bruni and Coluccio Salutati celebrated the active, engaged citizen, advocating for a return to the republican ideals of Cicero and the historical wisdom of Livy. Machiavelli was a product of this environment. His education was humanist, his prose style clear and forceful, his rhetorical skill evident in his diplomatic dispatches. He devoured Livy's Ob Urb Candida, History of Rome, not as a sentimental journey into a glorious past, but as a vast repository of political data, a manual for understanding the mechanics of state building and decline. However, where many humanists sought to derive moral precepts and ideal forms of government from classical texts, Machiavelli saw something else. The humanist emphasis on human agency, on the study of human nature and history, paradoxically opened the door for a more secular and pragmatic approach to governance. If humans were indeed the masters of their own destiny, then politics was not a divine play, but a human endeavor, subject to human rules, human strengths, and human failings. This allowed Machiavelli to strip away the theological and moralistic overlays that had traditionally dominated political thought since the Middle Ages. For him, the question was not what is the most virtuous way to rule, but what is the most effective way to rule, given human nature and the realities of power. He recognized that the pursuit of classical ideals, while noble, could be dangerously naive in a cutthroat world. The meticulous study of history, which humanism championed, also revealed that human affairs were messy, often brutal, and rarely conformed to abstract moral theories. This historical empiricism, combined with his own direct political observations, led him to a profound, almost scientific realism. He moved from the prescriptive, how things should be, to the descriptive, how things are, a fundamental shift that marked the birth of a new kind of political science. This newfound realism was tested in the most personal and painful ways imaginable. In 1512, after 14 years of dedicated service, Machiavelli's world collapsed. Foreign powers, particularly Spain and the papacy, intervened forcefully in Italy. The Florentine Republic, weakened and caught between warring factions, proved unable to withstand the might of the Holy Leg. A Spanish army devastated Prato, a town just outside Florence, and the Medici, backed by Spanish arms, marched triumphantly back into the city. The Republican experiment was over. Machiavelli, a prominent figure in the now-defunct Republican government, was immediately dismissed from office. His career was shattered, worse was to come. In early 1513, he was implicated in a conspiracy against the newly restored Medici. Though his involvement was almost certainly minimal, or even non-existent, he was arrested. For weeks, he was imprisoned and subjected to torture, specifically the strapado, where his hands were tied behind his back and he was hoisted by a rope, dislocating his shoulders several times. Imagine the physical agony, the psychological trauma, the profound sense of injustice for a man who had served his city so diligently. Yet, even under torture, he maintained his innocence, refusing to implicate others. He was eventually released, pardoned as part of a general amnesty following the election of a Medici pope, Leo X, but his public life was irrevocably over. He was exiled, banished from Florence to his small family farm in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, just south of the city. For a man of such restless intellect and boundless energy, who had lived at the very center of power, this enforced idleness was a torment. He was a political animal deprived of his natural habitat. This period of exile, however, became the crucible for his greatest intellectual achievements. In his famous letter to Francesco Vettori, dated December 10, 1513, Machiavelli describes his daily routine with a poignant blend of despair and enduring intellectual passion. By day, he would mingle with local farmers and innkeepers, discussing trivial matters, playing cards, indulging in the rough pleasures of common folk. But as evening fell, he would retire to his study, shed his mud-splattered clothes, and put on royal and courtly garments. In this ritual, he would enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them lovingly, I feed on the food that alone is mine and that I was born for. In this hallowed company, reading, questioning, and engaging with the great minds of antiquity, he felt no shame in speaking with them and asking them the reason for their actions. And it was here, in this painful solitude, spurred by a desperate desire to be useful to Florence once more, to offer his hard-won knowledge, that he began to write The Prince. His personal suffering, his dramatic fall from grace, and his profound disillusionment all fed into his work. The very real threat of foreign invasion, the instability of Florentine politics, and his own experience of being abandoned by Fortuna underscored the urgent need for a new, brutally effective form of statecraft. His emphasis on a ruler's need for adaptability, for the foresight to build dikes against the raging river of fate, stemmed directly from his observations of Cesare Borgia's rise and fall and his own catastrophic encounter with political reversals. He saw that leaders often failed not for lack of good intentions, but for a lack of understanding of human nature and the unforgiving logic of power. This period of exile also saw the writing of his much larger, more nuanced work, the Discourses on Livy, where he explored in greater depth the conditions necessary for a long-lasting republic, revealing his own republican sympathies that are often overshadowed by the provocative nature of the prince. Yet both works shared the same empirical, unsentimental approach to politics, born from the same crucible of his life experiences. His arguments were deeply informed by these trials. First, the supremacy of direct observation over abstract theory. Machiavelli famously states that he wishes to go directly to the effectual truth of the thing rather than to the imagination of it. His philosophy was not spun from academic cloth, but hammered out on the anvil of reality. He wasn't inventing theories, he was describing how power actually functioned, how men actually behaved in positions of authority, based on his own 14 years of high-level diplomatic and administrative experience, coupled with an intensive study of historical precedents. He saw firsthand that idealized moral principles often led to political ruin, while pragmatic, even ruthless, actions could secure the state. Secondly, he argued for the absolute necessity of political innovation in unstable times. Florence was a constant testament to political flux. The Medici's rise and fall, Savonarola's brief, fiery reign, the Republican experiment, constant foreign invasions, and the dizzying shifts in alliances. Old rules, traditional moral codes, and inherited institutions often proved inadequate to address these rapidly changing circumstances. For Machiavelli, a truly capable leader had to be willing to innovate, to break with tradition, and even to transgress conventional morality if the survival and stability of the state demanded it. This wasn't a call for wanton cruelty, but a sober recognition that in a world where men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and avaricious, a prince must be prepared to act decisively and pragmatically, even unpleasantly, to ensure the common good. To fully appreciate Machiavelli's radicalism, it is helpful to place him in conversation with his contemporaries and predecessors. Take, for example, his friend and fellow Florentine diplomat, Francesco Guicciardini. Guicciardini shared Machiavelli's empirical bent and skepticism towards abstract ideals. Both were men of action, steeped in the political realities of their time. Guicciardini's ricordi, maxims, offer a similar brand of pragmatic realism, emphasizing prudence and an understanding of human self-interest. However, Guicciardini was arguably more pessimistic than Machiavelli. While Machiavelli believed in the potential for virtù to control Fortuna, even if only partially, Guicciardini often saw the capriciousness of fate as more dominant, human agency as more limited, and the inherent corruption of human nature as an almost insurmountable obstacle. Guicciardini's realism was perhaps more resigned, less hopeful about the possibility of grand political designs or the transformative power of a single, decisive leader. He was a keen observer but less of a prescriptive theorist than Machiavelli, contenting himself more with cataloging the complexities rather than offering solutions. We can also look further back to thinkers like Marsilius of Padua, whose 14th-century work, Defensor Pacis, the Defender of Peace, offered a groundbreaking challenge to papal supremacy and argued for the autonomy of the state. Marsilius contended that the legitimate source of political authority resided in the people, legislator humanus, and that the state should be supreme in temporal matters, independent of the church. While Marsilius focused more on the source of legitimate power and the separation of spiritual and temporal authority, he paved the way for Machiavelli's radical secularization of politics. Machiavelli, too, effectively divorces politics from theology. For him, the state's survival and efficacy are its own justification. Its ends are internal and earthly, not divinely ordained. While Machiavelli in The Prince focuses on princely rule, his discourses reveal a strong preference for republics, echoing Marsilius's implicit trust in the collective wisdom of the people. Both thinkers, in their own ways, contributed significantly to stripping away centuries of divine right theory, grounding political power squarely in the realm of human action and necessity. The constant instability of Florence itself served as a relentless, unforgiving laboratory for Machiavelli's ideas. The The city's history was a dizzying carousel of shifting alliances, now with France, now with Spain, now with the Pope, now with the Holy Roman Emperor, each shift bringing new dangers and new opportunities. There were repeated republican uprisings against perceived tyranny, often followed by brutal suppression and the reassertion of strongman rule. The Medici themselves were expelled twice and returned twice, each time demonstrating the volatile nature of Florentine politics and the enduring struggle between liberty and order. This perpetual state of flux, this vulnerability of a disunited, often unarmed city-state, hammered home the lesson that survival depended not on static moral principles, but on dynamic adaptability, military strength, and astute political calculation. Machiavelli's life in the crucible of Florence was thus not merely a backdrop to his philosophy, it was the very forge in which his ideas were hammered out. His realism, his unsentimental analysis of power, his emphasis on virtù and fortuna, his willingness to confront the effectual truth of politics, all were direct consequences of his personal suffering, his extensive public service, and his profound observation of human nature in its rawest, most exposed forms. He wasn't an armchair philosopher. He was a man who had lived at the dangerous edge of power, witnessed its brutality, experienced its rewards, and ultimately endured its crushing weight. His writings are a desperate, brilliant attempt to distill these hard-won lessons, to understand politics as it truly is, in the fervent hope that his beloved Florence, and indeed any state, might finally secure its liberty and enduring stability in a treacherous world. His insights, born from this tumultuous era, would forever alter the course of political thought, marking the definitive birth of a new, pragmatic, and uncompromising realism. Welcome back. Our journey into the mind of Niccolò Machiavelli brings us now to his most famous, or perhaps infamous work, The Prince. Penned in 1513 amidst personal exile and political turmoil, this slender treatise was not merely a political theory, but a desperate plea, a strategic manual, and a profound, often unsettling meditation on power itself. It stripped away the comforting illusions of how politics should be, to reveal the stark, uncomfortable truth of how it often is. Machiavelli's ambition with The Prince was audacious. He wasn't writing for philosophers in ivory towers, nor for common citizens. He was writing for rulers, specifically for a new prince, one who comes to power not by inheritance or popular acclaim, but by skill, by force, by opportune circumstance. His aim was to provide a guide for acquiring and, more importantly, maintaining political power in the turbulent landscape of Renaissance Italy, a land fractured into competing city-states, vulnerable to foreign invasion, and ripe for unification under a strong, decisive hand. He dedicated it initially to Giuliano de' Medici, and later to Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger, hoping to ingratiate himself and perhaps to offer them the wisdom he believed essential to lead Italy out of its disarray. And what wisdom it was! The prince scandalized Europe and continues to provoke debate centuries later, precisely because it dared to separate the realm of politics from the traditional moral frameworks that had governed European thought for millennia. For Machiavelli, the primary goal of the prince was to preserve the state, to ensure its stability and security, and to safeguard its people. If achieving these ends required actions that might be considered morally reprehensible by conventional standards, then so be it. This was the effectual truth of things, as he famously put it, rather than the imagination of them. He was less interested in utopian republics or morally pure monarchies than in the harsh realities of governance in a world of imperfect men. To understand this revolutionary perspective, we must delve into two central, often intertwined, concepts that form the very bedrock of Machiavelli's political philosophy: virtù and fortuna. These are not simple ideas, and their translation requires a careful unraveling of their classical and Renaissance connotations. Let's begin with virtù. If you think of virtue in the traditional sense, kindness, honesty, piety, you'll quickly find yourself at odds with Machiavelli. His virtù is not primarily moral virtue, though it can, paradoxically, include the appearance of such. Rather, virtù in Machiavelli's lexicon refers to a complex set of qualities: skill, strength, courage, foresight, determination, and decisiveness. It is the capacity of a prince to act effectively and strategically in a chaotic world. A prince with virtù is adaptable, able to adjust his methods to the shifting demands of circumstances, knowing when to be fierce like a lion and when cunning like a fox. He possesses a keen understanding of human nature, a willingness to employ whatever means are necessary to achieve his objectives, and the audacity to seize opportunities when they arise. Think of it as political prowess, a blend of intelligence, will, and practical ability. A prince of virtù anticipates dangers, prepares for crises, and strikes with swift, resolute action. He has the strength of character not to be swayed by sentimentality, but to make hard choices for the good of the state. Machiavelli admires figures like Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, who possessed the virtue to establish a new city and forge a new political order, even if it meant fratricide. Or Moses, who led his people through the desert, relying on his strength of will and divine inspiration to overcome immense obstacles. These are men who created states, who imposed order where there was none, whose actions were driven by an unwavering commitment to their political goals. But even the most virtuosic prince cannot control everything, and this brings us to Fortuna. Fortuna is luck, fate, chance, the unpredictable currents of circumstance that can uplift or destroy even the most capable ruler. Machiavelli famously likens Fortuna to a raging river, which when in flood overflows the plains, sweeping away trees and buildings. When such a river rages, all human ingenuity and strength seem powerless before it. This metaphor vividly captures the overwhelming, destructive force of the unpredictable. He also famously describes Fortuna as a woman, asserting that she is more apt to be won by the impetuous than by those who proceed coldly. She favors the bold, the audacious, the one who is willing to take risks and act decisively, rather than the timid or cautious. This is a profoundly important distinction. Fortuna represents the elements of life that are beyond human control: unexpected deaths, sudden political upheavals, natural disasters, shifts in public mood that no prince could have foreseen. It is the realm of the arbitrary, the random, the things that simply happen. The challenge for any prince, then, is how to navigate this tempestuous sea of Fortuna, and this is where the interplay between virtù and Fortuna becomes crucial. Machiavelli argues that while Fortuna may be powerful, it is not omnipotent. A prince of virtù can, to some extent, prepare for the inevitable floods of Fortuna by building dikes and embankments during times of calm. This means establishing a strong military, securing alliances, ensuring popular support, and maintaining a well-ordered administration. Such preparations won't stop the flood entirely, but they can channel its destructive power, minimize its impact, and allow the state to recover more quickly. The prince must also possess the virtù to adapt to changes wrought by Fortuna. If circumstances demand a cautious approach, he should be cautious. If boldness is required, he must be bold. The tragedy, Machiavelli observes, is that men often cling to a single mode of conduct, whether it be caution or impetuosity, and are therefore undone when circumstances shift and demand an opposing approach. The successful prince is one who can change his character as the times and affairs demand. This is not hypocrisy in Machiavelli's eyes, but essential statecraft. Consider the famous example of Cesare Borgia, a figure Machiavelli deeply admired and presented as a model of virtù in action. Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, embarked on an ambitious campaign to consolidate power in Romagna, a region notoriously rife with lawlessness and fractious lords. He inherited no established state, no loyal army, and faced immense opposition. Yet, through a combination of strategic brilliance, ruthless determination, and calculated deception, he managed to create a powerful personal dominion. Borgia's actions in Romagna are a textbook case of Machiavellian virtù. He first conquered the region, then, to restore order and win the allegiance of the people, he appointed a cruel and efficient governor, Ramiro d'Orco, to brutally suppress dissent. Once d'Orco had accomplished this distasteful task and made Borgia appear as the benevolent liberator, Borgia had him publicly executed, his body cut in two and displayed in the piazza. This act, Machiavelli explains, satisfied the people and kept them in a state of terror. It was a demonstration of both strength and justice, of cruelty well used. Borgia then sought to make himself independent of his father's papal authority and the French military aid that had initially supported him. He understood that his power was built on borrowed foundations. He systematically eliminated his rivals, including the Orsini and Vitelli families, by luring them into a trap at Sinigalia, where they were all murdered. He even began to sow discord among the cardinals in Rome to ensure that a favorable pope would be elected upon his father's death. This was supreme foresight, anticipating future challenges and taking decisive action to mitigate them. However, despite all his virtù, Borgia was ultimately undone by an extreme stroke of fortuna. In 1503, both his father, Pope Alexander VI, died suddenly, and Cesare himself fell gravely ill with malaria at the very same time. This confluence of events, an utterly unpredictable and devastating blow, left him incapacitated and without his crucial political patron. The new pope, Julius II, whom Borgia had foolishly supported, believing he could control him, turned against him, and Borgia's painstakingly built power base crumbled. Machiavelli laments that Borgia was prepared for everything except this extraordinary and extreme malignity of fortune. He had built his dikes and embankments, but the river of Fortuna rose higher and faster than any could have imagined. Borgia's story for Machiavelli perfectly illustrates the limits of virtù and the overwhelming power of Fortuna. A prince can possess all the skill, foresight, and courage in the world, but there are some forces beyond human control that can still lead to ruin. Yet Borgia's virtù in constructing such a formidable, albeit temporary, power base from nothing remains, for Machiavelli, an exemplary demonstration of political excellence. This leads us to the heart of Machiavelli's most controversial advice, the practical, often brutal, strategies a prince must employ to acquire and maintain power. Machiavelli was not interested in what was morally pleasant, but in what was politically effective. Perhaps the most famous dictum is his analysis of whether it is better to be feared than loved. Machiavelli's answer, devoid of sentimentality, is unequivocal. It is much safer to be feared than loved if one of the two must be lacking. He explains that men are generally ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and avaricious. They will readily betray a ruler they love when danger is distant, but fear is held by a dread of punishment which never abandons you. Love is a bond of obligation that men, being selfish, will break when it suits their purpose. Fear, however, is a bond sustained by the apprehension of pain, a much more reliable motivator. He does not advocate for outright hatred, however. A prince should avoid making himself hated, for that can lead to conspiracies and rebellion. Hated rulers are those who seize the property or wives of their subjects. To be feared but not hated requires a careful balance. It means being decisive and firm, but not tyrannical or arbitrary. It means knowing when to be merciful and when to be severe, but always with an eye towards maintaining the security and stability of the state. This leads directly to the necessity of cruelty well used. Machiavelli differentiates between cruelty that is applied judiciously and effectively, and that which is gratuitous and self-defeating. Cruelty well used is that which is committed at a stroke from the need to secure oneself and then are not persisted in, but converted into benefits for the subjects. It is a means to an end. To establish order, to deter rebellion, to consolidate power, and then to pivot towards policies that benefit the populace. The goal is to bring about stability and security for the many, even if it requires harshness towards the few. Contrast this with cruelty badly used, which those are that increase with time rather than disappear, and that, though few in the beginning, grow rather than diminish. Such cruelty generates enduring resentment and constant fear, inevitably leading to the prince's downfall. Here, the example of Agathocles of Syracuse serves as a cautionary tale within Machiavelli's own framework. Agathocles rose from humble origins to become king of Syracuse, but his ascent was marked by extreme treachery and inhuman cruelty. He gathered the senators and leading citizens of Syracuse under false pretenses, then had his soldiers slaughter them all, seizing control of the city. While Machiavelli acknowledges that Agathocles possessed great virtue of mind and body, enabling him to overcome incredible obstacles, he concludes that such ruthless cruelty and inhumanity, together with his countless atrocities, do not permit him to be honored among the most excellent men. Agathocles acquired power but not glory because his methods were excessively cruel, leaving a legacy of hatred rather than loyalty. This is a crucial nuance. Machiavelli isn't advocating for cruelty for its own sake, but only as a necessary evil to secure and maintain the state, and even then it must be carefully calibrated. Another cornerstone of Machiavellian statecraft is the judicious use of deception. The prince, he asserts, must be a great simulator and dissimulator. In a world where men are simple and so much governed by immediate necessities, a prince who can skillfully deceive will always find those willing to be deceived. Machiavelli famously employs the analogy of the fox and the lion. Since a prince must know how to use the nature of the beast, he should pick the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend itself from snares and the fox cannot defend itself from wolves. So one must be a fox to recognize snares and a lion to frighten wolves. The prince must be strong enough to fight his enemies directly, the lion, but also cunning enough to avoid traps and outwit adversaries, the fox. This means being willing to break promises, to dissemble, and to manipulate appearances when it serves the interest of the state. Linked to this is the profound insight that it is more important for a prince to appear virtuous than necessarily to be so. A prince need not have all the above-mentioned qualities, but it is very necessary to seem to have them. He should appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright. However, he must be prepared to act contrary to humanity, contrary to charity, contrary to religion when necessity demands it. The perception of virtue, for Machiavelli, can be a powerful tool for maintaining public support and deterring opposition, even if the prince's actions behind the scenes are morally ambiguous. The masses judge by results and by appearances, not by the inner moral compass of the ruler. This revolutionary stance naturally brings us to Machiavelli's most striking philosophical departure: the separation of politics from traditional morality. For centuries, Western political thought, heavily influenced by figures like Plato, Aristotle, and particularly by Christian theology, had asserted that good government was inextricably linked to moral virtue. A good ruler was a just ruler, a pious ruler, one who acted in accordance with divine law or natural law. The purpose of the state was not merely to maintain order, but to foster virtue among its citizens, to guide them towards the common good, and ultimately to facilitate their salvation. Machiavelli dismisses these ideals as utopian fantasies. He famously states, "How one lives is so far removed from how one ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what should be done learns sooner his ruin than his preservation." He focuses on what is the effectual truth rather than what ought to be. Politics, for him, operates by its own distinct logic, a logic driven by power, necessity, and the unpredictable nature of human affairs. The rules of political success are not the same as the rules of individual morality. This is not to say Machiavelli was advocating for amorality in all spheres of life, or that he was personally evil. Rather, he recognized that the demands of statecraft sometimes necessitate actions that would be condemned in a private citizen. The prince, in a sense, operates under a different ethical code, one where the preservation of the state, the well-being of the collective, outweighs individual moral scruples. This rationale is rooted in his belief that if a prince were always good in a world where there are so many who are not good, he would inevitably be ruined. The prince must therefore be prepared to learn how not to be good. This pragmatic approach, this unflinching gaze at the dark underbelly of power, sparked furious counterarguments from his contemporaries and subsequent generations. Traditional moralists found his work deeply offensive. Figures like Cicero, for instance, in his De Officiis on Duties, passionately argued for the inseparable link between honesty, justice, and effective leadership. For Cicero, true glory and lasting power could only be achieved through virtuous conduct. Deception, cruelty, and the breaking of faith were not merely immoral, they were ultimately self-defeating, leading to instability, distrust, and the eventual downfall of the ruler. A ruler who acted unjustly, Cicero believed, would lose the respect and loyalty of his people, even if he temporarily gained power. The foundation of a strong state, he argued, was justice and the adherence to natural law, not cynical manipulation. Machiavelli's separation of politics from ethics was a direct affront to this ancient Roman ideal. Similarly, the towering figure of Thomas Aquinas, writing centuries before Machiavelli, articulated a comprehensive political philosophy grounded in Christian theology and natural law. For Aquinas, all human law and political authority derived ultimately from divine reason. The purpose of government was to guide society towards the common good, which included the moral and spiritual flourishing of its citizens. A ruler who acted against justice, mercy, or God's commandments was acting tyrannically and forfeited his moral right to rule. Aquinas would have found Machiavelli's effectual truth approach not just mistaken, but morally dangerous, leading humanity away from its proper end. For Aquinas, the ends never justify the means if those means violate divine or natural law. The initial reception of The Prince was predictably contentious. While it circulated widely in manuscript form for decades, it was not officially published until 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death. It quickly attracted both fascination and condemnation. It was placed on the papal index of prohibited books in 1559, becoming a symbol of godless tyranny. The term Machiavellian entered common parlance as a derogatory epithet, signifying cunning, duplicity, and ruthless opportunism. Anti-Machiavellian writers, such as Innocent Gentilet in his Anti-Machiavel 1576, openly attacked Machiavelli's philosophy, portraying him as a devilish instructor in tyranny. This demonization became so prevalent that for centuries to be called Machiavellian was a grave insult. Yet even as it was denounced, its teachings were secretly studied, and more often than not, practiced by rulers across Europe. The historical context that prompted Machiavelli to write The Prince is crucial for understanding its urgency and its seemingly ruthless advice. Italy in the early 16th century was not a unified nation-state, but a patchwork of competing entities. The Papal States, the republics of Florence and Venice, the Kingdom of Naples, and various duchies and lordships. This fragmentation made Italy vulnerable, a constant battleground for powerful foreign armies, particularly those of France and Spain. Machiavelli himself had witnessed this firsthand during his time as a Florentine diplomat, experiencing the humiliation of foreign occupation and the weakness of a divided Italy. He saw foreign invaders march through his homeland with impunity, exploiting its disunity. His hope, expressed poignantly in the final chapter of The Prince, was for a strong leader, a new prince, ideally from the powerful Medici family, to emerge and unify Italy, to expel the foreign barbarians, and to restore Italian pride and security. His seemingly cynical advice was not born of a love for cruelty, but from a desperate longing for order and national strength in a time of profound chaos and existential threat. He believed that only a prince willing to employ virtue in its most uncompromising form could achieve this monumental task. The book was, in essence, a patriotic call to action, albeit one delivered with chilling pragmatism. This brings us to cross-references to other influential thinkers and concepts that resonate with Machiavelli's insights. One prominent example is Thomas Hobbes, whose monumental work Leviathan, published in 1651, echoes Machiavelli's concerns about the necessity of a strong state for human order. Hobbes famously described the state of nature as a war of all against all, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this brutal existence, individuals enter into a social contract, surrendering some of their liberties to an absolute sovereign, the Leviathan, whose primary purpose is to enforce law and order, ensuring peace and security. While Hobbes arrived at his conclusions through a different philosophical route, a deductive argument from human nature and the social contract, rather than Machiavelli's inductive reasoning from historical examples, the practical implications are strikingly similar. Both Machiavelli and Hobbes recognized that a powerful, unwavering authority is often necessary to prevent societal collapse and to secure the lives of citizens. For both, the ultimate aim of political power is stability and security, and both were willing to countenance means that might be considered morally questionable by traditional standards if those means led to the preservation of the state. Hobbes's sovereign, like Machiavelli's prince, must possess the ultimate authority to command obedience and suppress dissent, lest society descend into chaos. Another important connection lies with the concept of realpolitik. This German term, emerging in the mid-19th century, describes a political philosophy that prioritizes practical considerations and national interests over ideological, ethical, or moral concerns. It is a politics based on realpolitik, on the realities of power, rather than on abstract ideals. States engaging in realpolitik make decisions based on what is expedient and effective for their own security and advancement, often disregarding international law, human rights, or moral principles. The classic example is Otto von Bismarck, who unified Germany through a series of calculated wars and diplomatic maneuvers, often employing deception and military force to achieve his goals, embodying a very Machiavellian pragmatism. Machiavelli is in many ways the intellectual godfather of realpolitik. His focus on the effectual truth, his insistence on judging actions by their outcomes for the state rather than their intrinsic morality, and his advice on the strategic use of force, deception, and the cultivation of an image, all prefigure the tenets of realpolitik. He provides a framework for understanding how states often do behave, even if they claim to be acting on higher moral principles. In international relations, particularly, Machiavelli's insights into power dynamics, self-interest, and the necessity of strength continue to resonate. So where does this leave us with Machiavelli's The Prince? It is not a book that offers easy answers or comforting platitudes. Instead, it presents a stark, almost clinical, examination of how power is acquired and maintained in a world populated by flawed human beings. Machiavelli forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that morality can be a liability in politics, that cruelty may sometimes be necessary, that appearances can be more potent than reality, and that even the most virtuose leader can be undone by the whims of Fortuna. His lasting legacy is not as an advocate for evil, but as a groundbreaking political scientist who dared to describe politics as it is, rather than as we might wish it to be. He pulled back the curtain on the stage of power, revealing the often brutal mechanics beneath the grand performances. And in doing so, he forever changed our understanding of leadership, statecraft, and the enduring tension between political necessity and moral aspiration. The Prince remains, to this day, an indispensable if unsettling guide to the art of power. While The Prince often captures the popular imagination with its stark, often chilling, advice on acquiring and maintaining power, it tells only half the story, and arguably the less profound half, of Niccolò Machiavelli's political philosophy. To truly grasp the breadth and depth of his thought, we must turn our attention to his other great work, Discourses on Livy. This extensive commentary on the Roman historian Livy's Ob Urbe Condita reveals Machiavelli not as the amoral advocate of princely tyranny, but as a passionate republican, a profound admirer of liberty, and a keen analyst of what makes states endure and flourish as free societies. Here we encounter Machiavelli, the civic humanist, deeply steeped in the classical tradition, offering a vision of governance rooted in popular participation, the rule of law, and the active engagement of its citizens. The Discourses isn't a manual for a lone ruler, but a guide for a collective, a people striving to maintain their freedom against the inevitable currents of corruption and decay. It is, in essence, a prolonged argument for why republics, for all their perceived complexities, offer the most stable and enduring path to human flourishing. Machiavelli's admiration for the Roman Republic is not merely academic. It is the bedrock of his political philosophy in the Discourses. For him, Rome wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was a living, breathing laboratory of political theory, a model of stable and free governance that stood for centuries, far outlasting any principality or empire of its time. He saw in Rome's tumultuous history, meticulously recorded by Livy, a practical demonstration of how political institutions could be forged, adapted, and sustained to harness the inherent energies and conflicts within a society for the common good. Rome, in Machiavelli's eyes, achieved an almost miraculous balance. It navigated internal strife, external threats, and the inevitable human tendency towards self-interest, evolving into a political entity that prioritized the freedom and participation of its citizens. He believed that the key to understanding this success lay not in Rome's emperors or its periods of autocratic rule, but in its foundational republican era, where power was shared and the populace held a significant, if often contested, voice. His intent was to extract universal lessons from this historical example, lessons that could be applied to his own fractured and corrupt Italy. As he writes in the preface to the Discourses, he hopes that his work might inspire someone to undertake it, so that if nature has not made me apt for founding a republic, it may at least show others how to do it. One of the most crucial elements Machiavelli identifies in Rome's enduring success is its mixed constitution. This idea was not entirely new. It had been theorized by ancient Greek thinkers like Polybius and most notably Aristotle. Aristotle, in his Politics, distinguished between three pure forms of government: monarchy, ruled by one; aristocracy, ruled by the few; and democracy, ruled by the many, and their corresponding corrupted forms: tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. He argued that each pure form was prone to degenerate, and thus, a polity, or a mixed constitution combining elements of all three, offered the best chance for stability. Machiavelli heartily endorsed this classical wisdom, observing how Rome, perhaps not by design but by necessity, developed a system that effectively balanced these distinct forces. The Roman consuls represented the monarchical element, providing decisive leadership, especially in times of war. The Senate embodied the aristocratic principle, drawing on the wisdom and experience of the elite. And critically, the tribunes of the plebs and the popular assemblies represented the democratic voice, allowing the common people to participate and assert their rights. Machiavelli marveled at how Rome, through its internal struggles, forged a constitution that naturally balanced these elements, preventing any single faction from gaining absolute power and thereby degenerating into its corrupt form. He understood that pure forms of government are inherently unstable. A pure monarchy risks becoming a tyranny, an aristocracy, an oligarchy, and a democracy, a licentious mob rule that paves the way for a new tyranny. The mixed constitution, by institutionalizing checks and balances, acted as a bulwark against this natural cycle of decay. As he states in Book I, Chapter 2 of the Discourses, "All those who have written on republics declare that one of the most necessary things to those who found a city is to ordain a mixed form of government. It ensures that the distinct interests and ambitions of different social classes are given a voice and a role, but are simultaneously constrained by the power of the other elements." This leads us to perhaps the most distinctive and counterintuitive of Machiavelli's arguments in the Discourses, the productive role of conflict. Unlike many classical thinkers who viewed internal discord as a disease that weakened the state, Machiavelli famously argued that the tumults or conflicts between the social classes, specifically the grandi nobles, patricians, and the popolo people, plebeians, were not only inevitable but could actually be beneficial, even necessary for a republic's health and liberty, if properly channeled. He understood that different social classes have different desires. The grandi seek to dominate and accumulate power, while the popolo desire liberty and not to be dominated. These conflicting desires are the engine of political life. Most theorists before him would have seen this as a recipe for civil war and ruin, but Machiavelli looked at Rome and saw something different. He pointed to the protracted struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. The plebeians, demanding greater rights and protection from aristocratic oppression, engaged in various forms of protest, including secessions where they would leave the city en masse. These conflicts were intense, sometimes violent, but they eventually led to crucial institutional innovations, the most significant being the creation of the tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes, elected by the plebeians, had the power to veto actions by the consuls or the Senate, effectively protecting the interests of the common people. Machiavelli's interpretation was revolutionary. These very conflicts, rather than destroying Rome, were the first cause of keeping Rome free, as he declares in Book I, Chapter 4. They forced the various factions to negotiate, to compromise, and ultimately to create new laws and institutions that broadened political participation and ensured justice for a wider segment of the populace. Without these tumults, the patricians might have become an oppressive oligarchy, eroding the liberty of the entire state. The internal friction, therefore, acted as a dynamic equilibrium, forcing constant adaptation and preventing stagnation, which Machiavelli saw as a prelude to corruption and decay. This perspective stands in stark contrast to the experience of Florence, Machiavelli's hometown. Florence also experienced constant internal conflict, but these often degenerated into violent factionalism, purges, and instability, frequently leading to foreign intervention or the rise of despots. The difference Machiavelli observed was that Florence lacked the robust institutional framework, exemplified by Rome's tribunes, to channel these conflicts constructively towards better laws and greater liberty. Instead, Florentine factions sought to utterly annihilate their opponents, leading to a cycle of revenge and instability. Complementing his views on mixed constitutions and productive conflict, Machiavelli championed the citizen militia as essential for the preservation of a republic's liberty. This was not a theoretical abstraction for him, it was a deeply personal conviction born from bitter experience. He had served as a diplomat and military organizer for the Florentine Republic and had witnessed firsthand the catastrophic unreliability and disloyalty of mercenary armies which were prevalent in Italy at the time. Machiavelli argued forcefully that a free republic must be defended by its own citizens. Mercenary soldiers, he contended, are motivated by pay, not by patriotism or love of liberty. They are fickle, often cowardly, and dangerously susceptible to being turned against the very state they are hired to protect. They have no personal stake in the outcome beyond their wages. A prince or a republic ought to have no other object, nor take any other thought than war, its organization and discipline. He asserts, a line that echoes from the prince but takes on a deeply civic resonance in the discourses. In contrast, a citizen army is composed of men who are fighting for their homes, their families, their property, and their freedom. Their motivation is intrinsic and profound. Such an army fosters civic virtue, discipline, and a shared sense of purpose among the populace. It binds the citizens more closely to the state, making them active participants in its defense rather than passive subjects relying on hired guns. Machiavelli's own efforts in Florence saw him instrumental in establishing the ordinanza, a citizen militia, to replace the city's notoriously unreliable mercenary forces. Though ultimately unsuccessful in securing Florence's liberty against more powerful foreign armies, this endeavor demonstrated his commitment to putting his republican ideals into practice. He saw in Rome's legions, composed of its own citizens, the military backbone that allowed it to expand and maintain its liberty for centuries. Finally, and perhaps most profoundly, Machiavelli underscores the absolute necessity of civic virtue among the populace to maintain liberty. This is not virtue in a purely moral or theological sense, but rather a public-spiritedness, the willingness of citizens to prioritize the common good and the well-being of the republic above their individual self-interest. For Machiavelli, even the best laws and institutions will fail if the citizens lack this fundamental commitment. Civic virtue manifests as honesty, courage, a willingness to participate in public life, to serve in the military, to pay taxes, and to obey the laws even when inconvenient. It is the active ingredient that breathes life into the constitutional framework. How is it fostered? Through good laws, education, and even religion, which Machiavelli, ever the pragmatist, viewed as a powerful tool for instilling discipline, obedience, and social cohesion, regardless of its spiritual truths. He cites figures like Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king, who established religious rites and institutions that instilled reverence and a sense of duty, binding the early Romans together. The dangers of corruption are ever present when civic virtue wanes. When citizens become consumed by avarice, ambition, and self-interest, they begin to undermine institutions, bend laws to their own advantage, and ultimately dissolve the bonds of community. The decline of the Roman Republic, for Machiavelli, served as a stark warning. As Rome expanded and grew wealthy, its citizens, particularly the elites, became less virtuous. Figures like Marius, Sulla, and later Caesar exemplify the corrosive effect of personal ambition overshadowing civic duty. The Gracchi brothers, while perhaps well-intentioned in their reforms, inadvertently highlight how even efforts aimed at the public good, when pursued through contentious and divisive means, can fuel factionalism and weaken the republic's unifying spirit. Their efforts to redistribute land, though arguably necessary, bypassed traditional political channels and ignited a century of civil strife. Machiavelli stressed that a republic, therefore, requires constant vigilance and periodic renewal, a return to its beginnings, Ritter ai principi, to refresh its foundational virtues and laws. This renewal might involve recalling harsh examples of justice or reminding citizens of the original principles of their liberty. The republic, like a living organism, needs regular tending to prevent decay. Now let's address the apparent tension, or perhaps profound complementarity, between the prince and the discourses. Many scholars have struggled to reconcile the ruthless, amoral advice given to a singular ruler in the prince with the fervent republicanism and emphasis on virtue found in the discourses. Is Machiavelli a cynical pragmatist or a principled idealist? A compelling interpretation suggests that these two works are not contradictory, but rather two sides of the same coin, addressing different political problems within the broader Machiavellian project of statecraft. The prince can be seen as a manual for founding a state, or for rescuing a state that has fallen into deep corruption and disorder. In such extreme circumstances, a prince, an extraordinary individual, might be required to employ extraordinary, even ruthless, measures to establish order, consolidate power, and create the stable foundations necessary for political life. This might involve acting outside conventional morality, using deception or force because the very existence of the state is at stake. It's a pragmatic, almost surgical approach to dealing with a deeply sick body politic, where the end goal is not tyranny but stability, paving the way for future liberty. The Discourses, on the other hand, is a manual for maintaining a stable, free, and virtuous republic once it has been established. It presumes a state that has achieved a certain level of order and is now capable of sustaining itself through laws, institutions, and the active participation of its citizens. Here, the focus shifts from the extraordinary actions of a single individual to the collective wisdom and virtue of a people. It's about preventing the slide back into corruption and disorder, fostering liberty, and ensuring longevity. One might argue that the prince offers the emergency medicine, while the Discourses provides the long-term regimen for health. A prince might be necessary to establish the conditions under which a republic can eventually flourish, or to refound one that has decayed beyond repair. Once stability is achieved and the fundamental structures are in place, then republican institutions, laws, and crucially, civic virtue become paramount. Perhaps Machiavelli understood that not every state begins in a state of grace, nor can every state be salvaged by democratic means alone. There are times when a strong hand is needed to clear the ground, before the seeds of liberty can be sown and cultivated by the many. Of course, Machiavelli's republican vision wasn't without its critics, both ancient and contemporary. One significant counterargument comes from Plato, whose critique of democracy in the Republic echoes through the centuries. Plato viewed democracy as inherently unstable, prone to mob rule, and ultimately leading to tyranny. He feared that in a democracy, freedom would degenerate into license, where all desires are equally valued, and the ignorant masses, swayed by demagogues, would make foolish decisions, lacking the true knowledge and virtue required for governance. The result, he predicted, would be chaos, making the populace yearn for a strong man to restore order, thus paving the way for a tyrant. While Machiavelli valued popular participation, he was acutely aware of these dangers, which is why his emphasis on good laws, strong institutions, and especially civic virtue was so crucial. He wasn't advocating for an unbridled, direct democracy, but a well-ordered republic with built-in checks and balances. Furthermore, traditional arguments for monarchy present another counterpoint. Proponents of monarchy often highlight its stability, the clear line of succession, the unity of command, and the efficiency of decision-making, particularly in times of crisis. They argue that a single, benevolent ruler can act swiftly and decisively for the good of the state, unhindered by the endless debates and factionalism inherent in republics. While Machiavelli in The Prince acknowledges the effectiveness of singular rule in certain contexts, in the Discourses he implicitly counters this by arguing that republics, while perhaps slower in deliberation, are ultimately more stable and adaptable due to their diverse councils, the broader base of popular support, and their capacity for self-correction. The collective wisdom of a virtuous citizenry, even if slower, often leads to more robust and enduring decisions than the potentially fallible judgment of a single monarch. A more contemporary challenge to Machiavelli's republicanism lies in the very idea of maintaining civic virtue in a self-interested populace. Is it realistic to expect citizens, especially in large, complex, modern societies, to consistently prioritize the common good over their individual self-interest? Economic theories like Adam Smith's invisible hand suggest that self-interested actions, when channeled through free markets, can paradoxically lead to public good. But Machiavelli's conception of virtue is more explicit and communal, requiring a conscious effort to subdue personal ambition for the state's benefit. Modern political theory often emphasizes designing institutions to account for self-interest, rather than relying on its suppression. Machiavelli himself, with his famous dictum that men are bad, understood that human nature is fundamentally self-serving. Hence, the need for good laws and strong institutions was not to eradicate self-interest, but to channel human passions and ambitions towards public ends, to create a framework where individual gain is aligned with or constrained by the needs of the Republic. Machiavelli's ideas, particularly those expressed in the discourses, had a profound and lasting impact on subsequent political thought. Montesquieu, the celebrated French philosopher of the Enlightenment, was deeply influenced by Machiavelli, Livy, and the Roman model. In his monumental work, The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu articulated his theory of the separation of powers, the division of governmental authority into legislative, executive, and judicial branches, which directly built upon Machiavelli's concept of a mixed constitution. Montesquieu sought to institutionalize a system of checks and balances that would prevent any one branch from becoming tyrannical, ensuring liberty through diffused power. He also distinguished between different principles animating different forms of government: virtue for republics, honor for monarchies, and fear for despotisms, echoing Machiavelli's stress on civic virtue for free states. The American founders, particularly James Madison, were avid readers of both Machiavelli and Montesquieu, and their design of the U.S. Constitution, with its tripartite government and numerous checks and balances, clearly bears their intellectual imprint. Machiavelli's insights continue to resonate profoundly in modern interpretations of political life. Debates about the fragility of democratic institutions, the importance of an engaged and informed citizenry, the dangers of political corruption, and the pernicious effects of extreme factionalism all find echoes in his discourses. His advocacy for citizen militias, while perhaps not directly applicable in a nuclear age, raises perennial questions about the relationship between military power, national defense, and civic participation, particularly concerning the role of a professional standing army versus a citizen-based defense force. We can also look to other historical examples through a Machiavellian lens, such as the Venetian Republic. Venice was famed for its extraordinary stability and longevity, lasting for over 1,000 years. Machiavelli admired Venice's ability to maintain its independence and internal peace, attributing it to its carefully constructed aristocratic republic, which, through elaborate checks and balances among its various councils and officials, largely avoided the violent internal tumults seen in Florence or even Rome. However, Machiavelli also implicitly critiqued Venice's lack of popular participation. Its stability came at the cost of the dynamism he saw in Rome, where the inclusion of the popolo in the political process fostered a more robust form of liberty. Venice represented an aristocratic stability, while Rome represented a more expansive, tumultuous, but ultimately, for Machiavelli, more vigorous republican liberty. To truly understand Niccolò Machiavelli, then, is to move beyond the narrow confines of the prince and engage with the grand vision of a free and enduring republic laid out in the discourses on Livy. Here we discover a thinker deeply committed to liberty, acutely aware of human nature's imperfections, and brilliantly insightful about the institutional structures and civic virtues required to sustain a self-governing people. His work remains a timeless guide for anyone seeking to understand the perennial challenges of creating and maintaining a free political society. We now turn to perhaps the most controversial, and certainly the most foundational, aspect of Machiavelli's philosophy: his understanding of human nature and the profound implications it carries for political ethics. This is where Machiavelli truly departs from the centuries of Western thought that preceded him, a departure that continues to provoke and challenge us even today. For Plato, political philosophy was ultimately rooted in a vision of human flourishing, of individuals striving for goodness and reason within an ideal state. For Aristotle, humans were naturally social and political animals, capable of virtue and self-governance. For Christian theologians, humanity, though fallen, possessed an immortal soul and a capacity for redemption, guided by divine law. Machiavelli, however, offered a far starker, more cynical, and in his view, more realistic portrait. He believed that to truly grasp politics, one must first confront the effectual truth of the thing rather than the imagination of it. and the effectual truth when it came to human beings was far from flattering. Machiavelli's view of human nature is, to put it mildly, deeply pessimistic. He wasn't simply a casual observer of human foibles. He posited these traits as the bedrock upon which all successful political action must be built. In The Prince, he famously declares, "For one can generally say this about men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, liars and deceivers, avoiders of danger, eager for profit." Let's unpack each of these deeply unsettling attributes. Ungrateful: imagine extending generosity, help, or clemency to someone, only to find it forgotten the moment their need passes. Machiavelli saw this as a universal tendency. A prince who relies on the gratitude of his subjects or allies is building on sand. Once the immediate benefit of his action has passed, or a new, more alluring opportunity presents itself, that gratitude will evaporate. This isn't just a personal slight, it's a political vulnerability. Fickle: humans, according to Machiavelli, are easily swayed, their loyalties shifting with the winds of fortune or opinion. Today they may adore you, tomorrow they may revile you, especially if danger or hardship arises. Their affections are shallow, easily redirected. This means a ruler cannot rely on the steadfast love of their people. Such love is too fragile, too fleeting. Liars and deceivers: this speaks directly to the untrustworthiness of human communication. Words are not always meant to convey truth. Often they are tools for manipulation, for gaining advantage, for obscuring true intentions. A prince who takes all words at face value is destined for ruin. He must learn to read between the lines, to discern hidden agendas, and to be wary of professions of loyalty that may mask betrayal. Avoiders of danger: when faced with a threat, Machiavelli believed, most people will prioritize their own safety above all else, even if it means abandoning principles, comrades, or promises. Courage is rare, self-preservation paramount. This has profound implications for military strategy and for maintaining order in times of crisis. A ruler must inspire fear, not just love, because fear is a more reliable motivator when danger looms. Love, Machiavelli asserts, is held by a chain of obligation which, because men are wretched creatures, is broken on every occasion for their own self-interest, but fear is sustained by a dread of punishment which will never abandon you. And finally, eager for profit. This is the insatiable avarice that drives so much human behavior. People are fundamentally motivated by what they can gain: wealth, power, status. Their loyalty can often be bought, and their resentment ignited if their possessions are threatened. A prince must be careful not to alienate his subjects by seizing their property or dishonoring their women, for these transgressions strike at the very core of their self-interest and will provoke the strongest resentment. This composite picture is not just a personal observation by Machiavelli, it's a profound anthropological claim. It asserts that at the core of human nature lies a fundamental self-interest, an inherent lack of steadfast virtue, and a susceptibility to fear and avarice. This isn't to say that moments of genuine goodness, generosity, or loyalty don't exist, but rather that in the rough and tumble world of politics, particularly when stakes are high, these softer virtues are unreliable foundations. They cannot be depended upon. So if this is human nature, what does it mean for leadership? It necessitates a radically different kind of political leader, one who understands this inherent depravity and acts accordingly, rather than relying on abstract moral principles or an idealistic vision of humanity. The prince, in Machiavelli's view, cannot afford the luxury of being good in the conventional sense if it jeopardizes the survival of the state. This leads us directly to the concept of the dirty hands dilemma, a problem Machiavelli essentially invented for political philosophy. Imagine a ruler faced with a choice: commit a morally repugnant act, perhaps torture an innocent, execute political rivals without due process, or betray an ally, but by doing so, save the state from civil war, invasion, or collapse. The alternative is to uphold traditional moral principles, but at the cost of catastrophic harm to the very people and institutions the ruler is sworn to protect. What does the prince do? Machiavelli's answer is clear. The prince must get his hands dirty. He must be willing to commit acts that would be considered evil or immoral in private life, if those acts are necessary for the greater good of the state. This is not an act of malice or personal depravity, but an act of supreme political responsibility. The ruler sacrifices their own soul, in a sense, staining their conscience for the sake of the collective. As Machiavelli puts it, a prince, and especially a new prince, cannot observe all those things for which men are considered good, because he is often forced to, in order to maintain his state, to act contrary to faith, contrary to charity, contrary to humanity, contrary to religion. This is a stark departure from previous ethical frameworks. Take, for instance, traditional Christian ethics, which emphasize virtues like charity, humility, forgiveness, and absolute truthfulness. A Christian ruler ideally would lead with moral purity, adhering to divine commandments, believing that God's justice would ultimately prevail. Machiavelli, however, implicitly argues that such a ruler would be devoured in the real world of power politics. He even suggests that Christianity, with its focus on the meek and humble, has weakened societies and made them less resilient. Our religion, he writes in Discourses on Livy, has glorified humble and contemplative men more than active ones. It has then placed the highest good in humility, abnegation, and contempt for worldly things. If our religion asks you to have strength in yourself, it wants you to be more apt at suffering than at doing something strong. This ethos, he argues, leads to political weakness. Contrast this also with Kantian deontology, an ethical framework that would emerge centuries later but stands in stark opposition to Machiavelli. For Immanuel Kant, moral duties are absolute, derived from reason, and apply universally, regardless of consequences. The categorical imperative dictates that one should act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Lying, for example, is always wrong, because if everyone lied, communication would break down, which is an irrational and self-defeating outcome. Furthermore, Kant emphasized treating humanity, whether in oneself or others, always as an end and never merely as a means. Machiavelli would find Kant's philosophy utterly naive and dangerous in the realm of politics. A prince who never lied, never broke a treaty, never used others as means to an end, the state's survival, would quickly be outmaneuvered and destroyed. The effectual truth of politics is that people do lie, do betray, and do treat others as means. For a prince to ignore this reality out of adherence to abstract moral laws is to court disaster for his entire state. The prince, for Machiavelli, must be willing to use others as means, to deceive, to manipulate, if it secures the survival and stability of the patria. The fate of the state and the lives of its citizens depend on it. This brings us to another critical distinction in Machiavelli, the separation of political morality from private morality. What might be considered a virtue for an individual in their personal life, honesty, generosity, piety, could be a severe liability, even a fatal flaw for a ruler. The ruler operates under a different moral calculus, one where the supreme value is the preservation and stability of the state. A prince who is too generous will deplete his treasury and become despised. A prince who is too honest will be deceived. A prince who is too pious might alienate factions or fail to take necessary brutal actions. This concept leads to the widespread and often misunderstood assertion that Machiavelli advocated for the ends justify the means. It's a phrase commonly attributed to him, yet he never explicitly wrote it. While it captures a central aspect of his thought, it's also a simplification that misses crucial nuance. Machiavelli isn't saying any end justifies any means. The end he has in mind is very specific. The survival, stability, and glory of the state itself, and the means must be effective in achieving that specific end. He's not advocating for nihilistic amorality, where one can do anything for personal gain. He's advocating for a pragmatic, consequentialist approach to statecraft where the well-being of the collective, embodied in the state, is paramount. For Machiavelli, the ruler's actions are judged not by their adherence to an abstract moral code, but by their outcomes specifically, whether they contribute to the security and prosperity of the state. If cruelty, deception, or betrayal lead to a more stable and prosperous state, then they are, politically speaking, good actions. If kindness, honesty, and mercy lead to the state's ruin, then they are, politically speaking, bad actions. This is the core of his effectual truth applied to ethics. The world is too dangerous, human nature too treacherous, for a ruler to indulge in moral idealism. Let's consider some concrete examples of the moral compromises Machiavelli envisioned rulers facing. Firstly, breaking treaties for state security. A prince, Machiavelli argues, cannot and must not honor his word when it places him at a disadvantage and when the reasons for which he made his promise no longer exist. This isn't an endorsement of arbitrary deceit, but a recognition that circumstances change. A treaty made under one set of conditions might become a death trap under another. If upholding a treaty puts the state at existential risk, the prudent prince must break it. Imagine a small state allied with a powerful neighbor against a common enemy. If that common enemy is suddenly defeated, and the powerful neighbor then turns its gaze covetously towards the smaller state, Machiavelli would say the smaller state must disengage from the alliance, even if it means breaking a solemn promise. The greater good of its own survival overrides the abstract principle of keeping one's word. Secondly, the use of spies and clandestine operations. These activities involve deception, betrayal, and often the exploitation of individuals, all of which would be morally suspect in private life. Yet for a state to defend itself, to understand the intentions of its enemies, and to anticipate threats, intelligence gathering is absolutely essential. A ruler who refuses to engage in such morally ambiguous activities on the grounds of personal integrity would leave their state vulnerable and blind. The modern world's intelligence agencies, with their necessary cloak and dagger operations, are a testament to Machiavelli's insight here. Thirdly, suppressing dissent, often through harsh measures. While we value freedom of speech and political pluralism today, Machiavelli operated in a world where internal dissent could quickly spiral into civil war, leading to untold suffering and the collapse of the state. A prince might be forced to execute conspirators, silence critics, or even take preemptive, brutal action against potential rebels to maintain order. Machiavelli famously praises Cesare Borgia's ruthless methods in Romagna, where Borgia employed a cruel minister, Ramiro de Orco, to bring order to a lawless province, then executed de Orco in a public spectacle to both quell the minister's growing power and appease the populace who had suffered under his harshness. This was a calculated act of terror and justice designed to achieve stability. These examples highlight the core of Machiavelli's argument, the necessity of adapting ethics to the effectual truth of politics. The political realm is distinct. Its rules are forged in the fires of power, necessity, and human depravity, not in the serene chambers of abstract morality. The inherent conflict between securing power and remaining good in the conventional sense is, for Machiavelli, unavoidable. A prince who strives to always be good will come to ruin among so many who are not good. Therefore, to survive and thrive, a prince must learn how not to be good, and to use this ability or not to use it according to necessity. However, Machiavelli's radical proposals have not gone unchallenged. Throughout history, and particularly in response to the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, powerful counterarguments have been mounted against the separation of ethics from politics. One major line of counterargument comes from moral absolutists. These are thinkers who believe that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of the consequences. For them, murder is always wrong, torture is always wrong, lying is always wrong, and these prohibitions apply to rulers just as they apply to individuals. To suggest that a ruler can commit such acts for the greater good is to open a Pandora's box, eroding the very foundations of morality and justice. If morality is entirely relative to outcomes, what prevents the powerful from simply defining good outcomes as whatever serves their own self-interest? This perspective argues that there are universal moral truths that bind all human beings, regardless of their position or the perceived necessities of statecraft. To abandon these truths is to abandon humanity itself. Another powerful counterargument is that divorcing ethics from politics ultimately leads to tyranny or societal decay. If a leader is allowed to shed personal ethics for political expediency, where does it stop? If there are no moral guardrails, what prevents a ruler from becoming a ruthless tyrant focused solely on their own power and survival, rather than the true stability of the state? Machiavelli himself warned against becoming hated, implying a boundary, but if the means are justified by the end of state survival, this can be a dangerously vague and malleable justification. Consider the implications for trust. If a ruler is known to be a liar and a deceiver, how can trust exist between the ruler and the ruled? How can citizens feel secure if their leader operates without a moral compass? This lack of trust can breed resentment, instability, and eventually, rebellion. A state built solely on fear and deception, it is argued, is inherently fragile. True legitimacy, some philosophers suggest, rests not just on power, but on a sense of justice and shared moral principles that bind society together. A ruler who consistently acts amorally undermines this legitimacy, making the state perpetually vulnerable to internal strife. Furthermore, how can a state engage in meaningful diplomacy or maintain alliances if its word is considered meaningless? If treaties can be broken at will, international relations descend into a Hobbesian war of all against all, making long-term cooperation and global stability impossible. The very concept of international law, which seeks to govern interactions between states based on shared principles, would be rendered void. Historically, this debate has played out repeatedly. Machiavelli himself observed countless instances of rulers making controversial decisions for state necessity. His admiration for Cesare Borgia, as mentioned, stems from Borgia's ruthless efficiency. Borgia's betrayal of his mercenary captains at Sinigalia, where he lured them into a trap and had them executed, was a shocking act of deception, yet it consolidated his power in Romagna and brought a semblance of order to the region. Machiavelli saw this as a necessary, if brutal, exercise of virtue. Another historical anecdote is the case of Louis XI of France, reigned 1461–1483, often dubbed the universal spider for his intricate web of cunning, diplomacy, and outright deception. Louis XI was known for his willingness to break promises, manipulate rivals, and use spies extensively to consolidate the French monarchy against powerful feudal lords and foreign adversaries like Charles the Bold of Burgundy. He preferred negotiation and intrigue to open warfare, but his methods were often Machiavellian in their immorality. He understood human nature's darker side and exploited it expertly to strengthen the French state, even if it meant earning a reputation for untrustworthiness. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we see Otto von Bismarck, the architect of German unification. His realpolitik approach was intensely Machiavellian. Bismarck famously stated that the great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions, but by iron and blood. He deliberately provoked wars against Denmark, Austria, and France when it suited his strategic aims, manipulated alliances, and famously altered the Ems dispatch to incite the Franco-Prussian War, all for the ultimate goal of a unified, powerful German empire. His critics denounced him as unscrupulous, but his admirers lauded him for his pragmatic genius in achieving his nation's destiny. The long-standing debate about the moral character of leaders echoes Machiavelli's challenge. Are we better served by leaders who are paragons of virtue, but potentially ineffectual in a dangerous world? Or by leaders who are effective, strong, and can navigate the treacherous currents of power, even if it means compromising their personal morality? This is the dirty hands dilemma made concrete. Do we want a leader who sacrifices their own integrity to save the nation, or one who maintains integrity while the nation suffers? It's a question that continues to plague democratic and authoritarian leaders alike. In modern political theory, the term Machiavellianism has even been adopted in psychology to describe a personality trait characterized by manipulativeness, cynicism, and an amoral disregard for others, often for personal gain. This reflects the dark side that critics perceive in Machiavelli's thought, a potential pathway to ruthlessness for its own sake, divorced from the genuine concern for the state that Machiavelli claimed. However, to purely condemn Machiavelli is perhaps to miss his point. He wasn't necessarily advocating for evil as a good, rather, he was describing the harsh realities of power and human nature as he saw them. He held up a mirror to the brutal truths of political life that many preferred to ignore or to sugarcoat with idealistic rhetoric. He forced us to confront the uncomfortable fact that what is necessary for the survival of the state might often conflict with what is traditionally considered morally good. Ultimately, Machiavelli leaves us with a profound, unsettling challenge. He asks us to consider whether a stable, secure, and prosperous society can truly be built and maintained if its leaders adhere strictly to abstract moral principles. He compels us to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that in a world populated by ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers, a prince must sometimes act like a fox and a lion rather than a lamb. His legacy is not a simple endorsement of evil, but a stark, unflinching demand that we open our eyes to the effectual truth of human nature and its enduring, thorny problem for political ethics. And so we arrive at the enduring legacy, the critiques, and the modern echoes of Niccolò Machiavelli, a figure whose name, nearly 5 centuries after his death, still evokes a potent mix of fascination and fear. His ideas, encapsulated most controversially in The Prince, cast a long and often dark shadow over political thought, sparking debates that continue to rage today about power, morality, and the very nature of leadership. From the moment it was secretly circulated and later published, The Prince ignited a firestorm. It was almost immediately met with outrage and condemnation. The book was placed on the papal index of prohibited books in 1559, a clear sign of its perceived danger to established religious and moral order. This initial wave of hostility rapidly solidified into a deep-seated suspicion, giving birth to the term Machiavellianism. What does it mean to be Machiavellian? It quickly became a pejorative, a shorthand for ruthless, cunning, and deceptive political behavior, devoid of moral scruples and focused solely on the acquisition and maintenance of power. To call someone Machiavellian was to accuse them of cynical opportunism, a willingness to betray, lie, and even kill, all in the name of political expediency. It described a world where the ends always justify the means, where appearance is more important than reality, and where virtue is a weakness rather than a strength. This negative interpretation took root deeply, especially in Protestant Europe, where Machiavelli was often associated with Catholic intrigue and Italian deceit. In Elizabethan England, this image became particularly vivid. Playwrights eager to tap into popular anxieties portrayed Machiavelli as a devilish figure, a master of cunning and dissimulation. Perhaps the most famous embodiment of this stereotype can be found in Christopher Marlowe's chilling play, The Jew of Malta. Marlowe's character, Barabbas, is practically a personification of the Machiavellian villain. He opens the play with a soliloquy, boasting of his cynical philosophy. Many have argued about the nature of man and about the things that will make him great. I have found that the easiest way to prosper is to be devoid of all scruple, to promise all, to keep nothing. He openly embraces what he calls policy, a cold, calculating approach to life where murder, deception, and treachery are merely tools in a grand, amoral game. Barabbas revels in his villainy, delighting in his own cleverness and the suffering of others, all while invoking Machiavelli's name. This portrayal, along with other popular representations, cemented the image of Machiavelli as a teacher of evil, a purveyor of political poison. It was a caricature, certainly, but one that proved remarkably resilient. Beyond the dramatic stage, more formal critiques began to emerge, often taking the form of anti-Machiavellian treatises. These works directly challenged Machiavelli's principles, championing traditional virtues, divine right, and moral governance. One of the most famous examples comes from none other than Frederick the Great of Prussia. Before he ascended to the throne in his youth, Frederick wrote Anti-Machiavel, an impassioned refutation of the prince. Published in 1740 with the enthusiastic support and editorial assistance of Voltaire, the treatise argues vehemently against Machiavelli's principles. Frederick, then a hopeful prince, proclaimed that rulers should be virtuous, just, merciful, and uphold the highest moral standards. He argued that a good king rules by law and reason, not by fear and deceit, and that true glory comes from serving the people, not from tyranny. He declared that Machiavelli's counsel was the most dangerous book in the world, teaching the science of despotism and the art of crime. Yet, the irony of anti-Machiavel is perhaps one of the most striking footnotes in Machiavelli's legacy. Once Frederick became king, his reign in many ways became a masterclass in the very Machiavellian tactics he had so vehemently condemned. His invasion of Silesia, his participation in the partitions of Poland, his calculated alliances and deceptions, all demonstrated a pragmatic, often ruthless, approach to statecraft that prioritized national interest and power above conventional morality. It's a testament to the persistent tension between idealistic political theory and the brutal necessities of realpolitik that Machiavelli so starkly revealed. Even a king who set out to refute him found himself, perhaps reluctantly, walking a similar path. Modern criticisms of Machiavelli often echo these historical concerns. Scholars and commentators continue to grapple with whether he was a moral relativist, a cynical advocate for power at any cost, or a prophet of political amorality. His ideas are seen by some as incompatible with the principles of modern liberal democracy, with its emphasis on transparency, human rights, and the rule of law. They question whether a truly ethical leadership can ever embrace even a sliver of Machiavelli's pragmatism without sliding into tyranny. But to truly understand Machiavelli's enduring legacy, we must move beyond the simple caricature and delve into the more complex, and often contradictory, interpretations offered by subsequent political thinkers who found in his work not just a manual for tyranny, but profound insights into human nature and the mechanics of the state. One of the earliest and most astute reappraisals came from the English philosopher and statesman, Francis Bacon. Writing in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Bacon, a proponent of empirical observation and a keen student of human affairs, recognized Machiavelli not as a teacher of evil, but as a realist. Bacon famously stated that Machiavelli writes what men do, not what they ought to do. For Bacon, Machiavelli was a clear-eyed diagnostician of political reality, stripping away comforting illusions to reveal the raw forces at play. He admired Machiavelli's inductive method, drawing conclusions from historical examples and observable human behavior rather than from abstract ideals. Bacon saw Machiavelli as providing an unvarnished truth about power, a necessary guide for anyone seeking to understand the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. This was a crucial shift from condemnation to appreciation of Machiavelli's analytical rigor. A generation later, Thomas Hobbes, writing amidst the chaos of the English Civil War, found much to resonate within Machiavelli's stark vision. Hobbes, deeply concerned with order and the prevention of anarchy, shared Machiavelli's pessimistic view of human nature. Both believed that humans, left to their own devices, are fundamentally self-interested, driven by a perpetual desire for power, leading to a war of all against all. For Hobbes, Machiavelli's emphasis on the necessity of a strong, centralized sovereign power, whether a prince or a leviathan, to maintain peace and prevent society from dissolving into chaos, was a profound and uncomfortable truth. The raw authority Machiavelli prescribed for a prince to establish and maintain the state found its philosophical justification in Hobbes's argument for an absolute sovereign, whose power, however absolute, was seen as essential to civil society and personal security. Perhaps one of the most surprising and radical reinterpretations came from the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Living in the late 17th century, Spinoza was a staunch advocate for freedom and republicanism. In his Tractatus Politicus, Spinoza argued that Machiavelli was, in fact, a republican at heart, and that the prince should be read not as a handbook for tyrants, but as a cunning exposure of their methods. Spinoza suggested that Machiavelli deliberately presented the cruelties and deceptions necessary for a prince to maintain power, precisely to warn free citizens. By laying bare the brutal reality of princely rule, Machiavelli was, in Spinoza's view, teaching the populace what they needed to know to recognize and resist such tyranny. The prince then becomes a veiled critique, a political satire, a republican's warning wrapped in the guise of advice to despots. This interpretation demands a sophisticated, ironic reading of Machiavelli, one that looks beyond the surface text to infer a deeper, subversive intent. This Machiavelli as a republican satirist idea gained even greater prominence with Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. In his seminal work, The Social Contract, Rousseau famously declared, "Machiavelli was a decent man and a good citizen. In pretending to give lessons to kings, he gave great ones to peoples." The Prince is the book of republicans. For Rousseau, Machiavelli's purpose was not to instruct tyrants on how to rule, but rather to reveal to the people the true nature of their rulers and the art of tyranny, thereby making them more sensible of the true nature of their rulers. By exposing the immorality and deceit inherent in absolute power, Machiavelli was, according to Rousseau, implicitly teaching citizens how to guard against it and how to cherish their own liberty. This interpretation fundamentally flips the traditional understanding of the prince on its head, transforming it from a villainous text into a tool for popular enlightenment and republican defense. Moving into the 20th century, the debate around Machiavelli intensified with further profound reappraisals. Leo Strauss, a hugely influential political philosopher, offered a particularly stark and controversial interpretation. For Strauss, Machiavelli marked a decisive and deeply problematic break from classical political philosophy and traditional morality. Strauss argued that Machiavelli was not merely describing human behavior, but was actively teaching a new, lower standard for political life. He saw the prince as a deliberate attempt to subvert the classical concept of virtue, which aimed at the highest good in Christian ethics, which emphasized humility and otherworldliness. Instead, Machiavelli, according to Strauss, advocated for a pragmatic, amoral approach that prioritized earthly success and the acquisition of power above all else. Strauss famously labeled Machiavelli a teacher of evil, a philosopher who dared to explicitly recommend immoral actions for political ends, thus initiating a dangerous trend in Western thought that, for Strauss, eventually led to the moral relativism and nihilism of the modern age. Strauss's dense and complex arguments see Machiavelli as the first enlightener, who fundamentally altered the trajectory of political thought by divorcing it from virtue and piety. In contrast to Strauss, Isaiah Berlin, another towering figure in 20th century philosophy, offered a more tragic and nuanced view in his essay, The Originality of Machiavelli. Berlin argued that Machiavelli's true originality lay not in teaching evil, but in revealing a profound and unresolvable dilemma: the incompatibility of two great, legitimate systems of morality. On one hand, there was the classical, pagan morality of the ancient world, which valued virtue, civic glory, strength, courage, public service, and the flourishing of the state. On the other hand, there was Christian morality, which emphasized humility, charity, compassion, and the pursuit of salvation in an afterlife. Berlin contended that Machiavelli showed that one simply cannot always pursue both sets of values simultaneously. Sometimes the demands of the state and the pursuit of civic glory require actions that are fundamentally contrary to Christian ethics. Machiavelli, according to Berlin, was not advocating for one over the other, but exposing a tragic choice, a permanent tension between two valid yet conflicting conceptions of the good life. For Berlin, this was not about Machiavelli being a teacher of evil, but about his willingness to confront and articulate an uncomfortable truth about the inherent moral complexity of political life. These diverse interpretations highlight the ongoing debate. Was Machiavelli a cynical manipulator, cold and calculating, seeing humanity as merely instruments for power? Was he a passionate patriot, desperately seeking a strong leader to unite Italy and free it from foreign domination, willing to endorse any means necessary for such a noble end? Was he, as Rousseau and Spinoza argued, a committed republican, using the prince as a cunning trap for tyrants or a warning to free citizens? Or was he, as Francis Bacon suggested, primarily a neutral political scientist, simply describing the brutal mechanics of power as they are, without necessarily endorsing them, much like a physician describes a disease without advocating for it? The enduring richness of Machiavelli's work lies precisely in its ability to sustain these multiple, often contradictory, interpretations. It forces us to confront our own biases and assumptions about power and morality. Machiavelli's insights, however controversial, have undeniably echoed through history, influencing countless leaders and providing a lens through which to understand real-world political dynamics. His ideas, even when not explicitly acknowledged, inform much of what we recognize as Machiavellian tactics in practice. Consider historical figures often accused of employing Machiavellian tactics. Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister to Louis XIII of France in the 17th century, is a prime example. Richelieu centralized royal power, ruthlessly suppressed aristocratic challenges, and pursued France's national interest with a relentless pragmatism, even allying with Protestant powers during the 30 Years' War against Catholic Habsburgs. His concept of raison d'etat, the idea that the state's survival and interests are paramount, sometimes above individual morality or religious doctrine, is a direct descendant of Machiavelli's thought. Richelieu understood that the stability and power of the state often required difficult, ethically ambiguous decisions. Centuries later, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who unified Germany in the 19th century, also embodied many Machiavellian principles. His Realpolitik, a foreign policy based on pragmatic considerations of power and national interest, rather than on ethical or ideological concerns, involved calculated deceptions, opportunistic alliances, and a willingness to wage blood and iron wars when necessary. Bismarck masterfully manipulated diplomatic situations, engineered conflicts to achieve his aims, and understood the critical role of military strength in asserting national will. These actions, while arguably leading to a unified and powerful Germany, are undeniably steeped in the kind of strategic ruthlessness Machiavelli described. In modern geopolitics, the ghost of Machiavelli is ever present. From covert operations and intelligence gathering to strategic alliances of convenience between ideologically disparate nations, from economic sanctions wielded as political weapons to the complex, often morally ambiguous dance of great power competition, the principles outlined in The Prince feel remarkably current. When nations prioritize national interest above international law, when leaders engage in calculated deception to gain an advantage, or when the appearance of strength is meticulously cultivated, we see the enduring shadow of Machiavelli. Even in the business world, the term Machiavellian is sometimes applied. Aggressive market strategies, corporate takeovers, ruthless competition for market share, strategic alliances, and the often cutthroat pursuit of profit can all be seen through a Machiavellian lens. Leaders in these arenas, while not princes in the traditional sense, often operate under similar pressures to maintain power, ensure prosperity, and outmaneuver rivals, sometimes adopting an ends justify the means approach. The focus on strategic thinking, power dynamics, and competitive advantage, rather than necessarily malice, shows how Machiavelli's analysis transcends purely political realms. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the complex reception of Machiavelli. Voltaire, as we've noted, initially championed Frederick the Great's anti-Machiavel, contributing to the popular image of Machiavelli as a cynical teacher of tyrants. Yet Voltaire himself was a shrewd observer of power and human nature. As he aged, his views on Machiavelli became more nuanced. While never fully endorsing Machiavelli's amorality, Voltaire recognized the undeniable truth in his observations about how power is acquired and maintained. He understood that Machiavelli had accurately described the realities of governance, even if those realities were distasteful. Voltaire wrestled with the uncomfortable mirror Machiavelli held up to the human condition, acknowledging its accuracy even as he deplored its implications. Perhaps one of the most chilling anecdotes comes from the 20th century with Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. Mussolini, who saw himself as a modern-day prince, was a fervent admirer of Machiavelli. He wrote a doctoral thesis on the prince, praising Machiavelli as a profound realist and a guide for achieving national power and unity. Mussolini viewed the prince not as a satire or a warning, but as a direct, practical manual for modern dictators. He saw in Machiavelli a justification for the strong state, for the necessary ruthlessness of leadership, and for the use of propaganda and force to mold public opinion and maintain control. Mussolini's interpretation stands as a stark warning about how Machiavelli's pragmatic advice, divorced from context and twisted for nefarious ends, can be used to legitimize tyranny and oppression. Bringing Machiavelli into our present moment, we can see how his insights remain strikingly relevant in a globalized, complex world. The cross-references to contemporary discussions on leadership and ethics in governance are undeniable. How do modern leaders, especially in democracies, balance ethical considerations, transparency, accountability, human rights with the pragmatic demands of governing, such as national security, economic stability, or managing complex geopolitical crises? The tension between idealistic principles and the messy reality of governance is a constant struggle. When is strategic secrecy necessary for national interest, and when does it become a threat to transparency? When does decisive action, sometimes bypassing conventional ethical norms, become justified for the greater good, leading to what philosophers call the dirty hands problem? Machiavelli forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions. He also sheds light on the nature of power in both democratic and authoritarian regimes. While his language of princes and fortunes might seem antiquated, the underlying dynamics of power, influence, and control he described are timeless. Democracies, too, require effective power management, strategic thinking, and the ability to project authority, even if framed within constitutional limits and democratic processes. Understanding how power operates, even its darker aspects, can equip citizens and leaders alike to navigate political landscapes more effectively. Conversely, authoritarian regimes often explicitly leverage many of Machiavelli's principles: the manipulation of public opinion, the suppression of dissent, the cultivation of fear and loyalty, the strategic use of force to maintain their grip on power. In a world grappling with cyber warfare, disinformation campaigns, economic power plays, and the existential challenges of climate change and global pandemics, Machiavelli's analysis of human nature and political strategy feels unnervingly pertinent. The constant struggle for power and influence, whether between states, corporations, or ideological groups, continues to shape our reality. The fundamental question Machiavelli implicitly poses to us remains: can one be truly effective in politics? Can one secure the stability and flourishing of a state without, at least occasionally, resorting to methods that challenge conventional morality? Or is a degree of pragmatism, a clear-eyed understanding of power dynamics, always necessary, even for those striving for the most benevolent ends? In conclusion, Niccolò Machiavelli is not a figure to be easily dismissed or simply condemned. His legacy is one of profound complexity and persistent ambiguity. He was not merely a cynical advocate for evil, but a deeply incisive analyst of power, a political realist who dared to describe politics as it is, rather than as it should be. He holds up an uncomfortable mirror to human nature and the necessities of statecraft, forcing us to confront the often brutal realities that lie beneath the polished veneer of political discourse. Whether we view him as a patriot, a republican, a neutral scientist, or even a teacher of evil, his work continues to provoke, to challenge, and to inform our understanding of the perennial struggle for power in a world that, for all its technological advancements, remains deeply human and often profoundly Machiavellian. His shadow, far from fading, continues to remind us that in the realm of politics, the path of virtue and the path of necessity are often tragically divergent.